happens is that there's no self. There seems to be someone sitting at the front of a room, addressing other people sitting in the room, and declaring that there's no self. It seems a bit counterintuitive, to say the least, but I think we're here maybe to explore the possibility that our intuitions are quite often wrong, particularly when it comes to the most basic, what seems to be fact of existence, which is that I exist as a person living in a world which is separate from me. That seems to be the most basic fact for most of us. It seems self-evident, never to be questioned. I exist as a separate individual, and I live something called my life. I live this story called my life, moving through a world which is separate from me, and meeting up with, and sometimes kind of knocking against, other individuals who are moving through this external thing called the world. And really the whole purpose of this afternoon, the only purpose of this afternoon, apart from maybe to meet some companionable people, drink some tea, eat a biscuit or two, apart from that, the only purpose of this afternoon is to kind of examine and explore that astonishing statement or that astonishing suggestion. It may not be astonishing, in fact I know it's not astonishing for many of the people sitting in this room. It may not be astonishing for anyone sitting in this room, but by God, you go out there onto Hampstead High Street, you go into Waterstones or Tesco's or Ollie and Stevens if you've got enough money, and start announcing this, and you'll be met with some astonishment, possibly some antagonism as well. I've said before, if you want to start, I can't imagine why any of us would want to start a fight in a pub, but if we did want to start a fight in a pub, one of the quickest, well, at least an argument, one of the quickest ways to do it is to suggest that there's no one sitting there holding that cup of water. There's no one sitting there behind that camera. There's no one sitting at the back there with their head to one side. There's no one sitting over there with a backpack at their feet. I mean, this is really an astonishing suggestion. And it seems to run counter to what seems to be my experience of life and our experience of life. But the suggestion from here is that pretending for a moment that there's time, of course there isn't any time, and later on this afternoon we might pick at that one and discuss it, but pretending for the moment that there is time, because I'm kind of spinning a narrative here, I'm spinning a story here, and that always involves time. So pretending for a moment that there is time, the suggestion from here is once upon a time, because this is a kind of fairy story, once upon a time there wasn't that sense of I exist as a separate entity moving through an external world. And that time, of course, is that when we were born and we're very, very young. So you could say what we're talking about here is the possibility of the collapse of duality. I'll come back to that word in a little while, the collapse of duality and the seeing of non-duality. But you could say that in talking about that, in examining that, in looking for it, in yearning for it in some of our cases, what we're really doing in some ways is yearning for that initial state when we were first born, because the newborn doesn't exist in separation. In other words, the newborn has no sense of itself as separate, whatever the sense of the newborn might be. It's not I am separate from the world which I have apparently been born into. And yet nevertheless, for almost everyone, at a certain age, usually quite a young age, that sense of separation begins to happen. It's like awareness, what we could call maybe just pure awareness begins to separate into awareness of me over here and awareness of everything and everyone else over there separate from me. And when that starts to happen, we could say, okay, now the great adventure of being a person has started. Whatever age it is, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, may be different for different individuals. People argue about what that age might be. It doesn't matter at all. Who cares? For most of us, for almost all of us, that sense begins to arise. I am located in a very, very specific place, and that place is called here, over here. And everything else is located in another place called over there. And there's a space which encompasses both of those things, so I can move through that space as a separate individual. And I can bump up against other separate individuals. And I can have fun with them, I can have joy with them, I can have rouse with them, I can have anger with them, I can have love with them. I can have all sorts of adventures. So this great adventure of being a person, has started at that point. And for most of us, it increases and increases with intensity, and there's never particularly any reason to question what seems to be this absolute reality. This absolute reality, I am separate. Hello.
Hello.
Here. There seems to be no reason at all to question it, partly because all these other apparent people that I come up against or with in my journey through life equally believe they're separate. Depending on what culture I'm born into, I will come across probably, this story, that story, another story, a religious story, whatever it might be, all of which will encourage me in this conviction. I don't want to call it a belief or a conviction or a feeling, because it's all of those three things, but we don't have a word that encompasses all of that. I'll be enveloped, if you like, in other apparent people who are colluding with me, fully believing with me maybe, that I am now a separate individual and I'm in charge of something very important called my life. And out of this arise some very, very important other characteristics, all of which are going to be challenged this afternoon, every single one of which will be challenged this afternoon. So here I am, I'm a separate individual moving through an external world, external to me. I have something called my life, which is a very precious treasure. I have responsibility for that. Oh no, oh my God, I'm only 4 years old and already I've got responsibility for this colossal, precious gem, which I have to carry now, called my life. I have responsibility, and to help me fulfill my might be God-given fate or dharma or whatever it might be, depending on what belief systems I'm introduced to, to help me grow and mature into a fully functioning, wonderful human being whose life works. This is a mythical creature, by the way, a human being whose life works. That's a mythical creature. It's a bit like a unicorn, except I think unicorns might have been spotted a little bit more often than a human being whose life works. Help me on in this task. I might not be given whatever it might be, beliefs, religious beliefs, political beliefs, beliefs about society, beliefs about responsibility, particularly beliefs about free will. So I'm now living in this external space carrying something called free will and responsibility, and there's something called time that I'm moving through, and I've only got a limited amount of that. We don't know what that will be, but usually it's not much more than about 80 or 90 years, so you better get on and use it well. No wonder some of us might start to be looking rather tired by the time we get to whatever age the tiredness kicks in. We're kind of given these great gifts by the adults around us, you know, beliefs and religious stories and moralities and purpose and all of these good things. We're given these wonderful gifts. It's a bit like, I'm pausing, so I'm just trying to think, which one was it? It was Sleeping Beauty, wasn't it? It was Sleeping Beauty, where the fairies all line up at her birth and give her these wonderful gifts. And then the last fairy, of course, is, well, the wicked fairy. She's not really wicked, she's just a bit put out because she wasn't invited to the christening. So she gives Sleeping Beauty, I believe it's the gift of death, isn't it? And then it's commuted to 100 years of sleep, something like that. So we're given all these wonderful gifts. And at least one of those gifts will be poisonous. And from the list that I've made, like responsibility, for example, religious stories, I suggest that more than one of them is going to be poisonous. Okay, now, there you are. Now get on with it. But I'm only 40 years old, never mind. Get on with it. Live this life. So the suggestion from here is a really simple one, that all of that, I think there's a technical term for this, let me see if I can remember it, all of that is complete crap. And that can suggest, the importance is really important. This is really the only important bit of this afternoon. So once I've said this, you can sort of leave en masse unless you want a cup of tea and a biscuit. You know, the really important thing about that is that it all hangs on this basic premise that there is this certain person. They live in something called time. They're moving from something called the past to something called the future, through something called the present, and perhaps most of all they have this tremendously precious gift called free will, through which they can make their life work or not work. So having laid that out, now let's forget about all of that. So the suggestion here is a very simple one, that all of that, every single part of it can collapse. Every single part of it can collapse. It can all, to use a phrase I've used before, many other speakers and writers about this have used, it can all be seen through. It can simply be seen through. One way of putting this is that the sense of separation can collapse. It can simply be seen that the one who seemed to be, I'm using this word very carefully, not thought to be, which is just a mental construct, the one who seems to be, it's much more than thinking. The one who seems, it's a felt sense being separate, it's a felt sense of the one who seems to be separate. Simply isn't. It can simply collapse. And then it's seen that there's no one here, and because there's no one here, there is no here. So we're on to one of the very challenging things that can be said about this. There's no here and there, there's no space. How can that be? It just seems so obvious that there's space. It seems so obvious that I came from a different place to this one, through other places, and I arrived here today, and all those places can only exist because they occupy space. So the suggestion from here is one of the astonishing things that's seen when the person collapses is there's no space, because space is created by the separation of the person from that into this. Because there's a person, there seems to be that out there and this here. And when that collapses, it's seen that there is no space. We could say that awareness is equally everywhere. Awareness is a bit of a weasel word. In some non-duality talks, it's a forbidden word. Anyway, I'm going to use it. If anybody wants to challenge me about it, we'll come on to that, but I'm leaving that up to you. And then another astonishing thing And it can't be explained, this. I mean, you know, it can't be justified intellectually, really. It's just seen. I'm avoiding the word experience because I think experience belongs to the individual, so it can simply be seen that there's no time. If you like, as T.S. Eliot, I think, put it, all time is one time. There is only one time. So in that case, there's no time. There's no past. There's no future. In a sense, there's no present. There is just this. And if you challenge me about that and say, well, if you say there's just this, surely that's the present. I have two options. I think one is to burst into tears and the other is to say we'll come back to that one later as well. So I'll take the second option because I think I can avoid the tears if we do that. So there's no person, there's no time, there's no space. What the hell is there then? What the hell is there? Well, on the most basic level, and without going all kind of spiritual and transpersonal on you, which I might do later, who knows, but on the most basic level, what I'm sure many of you have read, heard other people say, heard me say, and I'm quite sure I'm going to use the word experienced yourselves very inadvisedly. I mean, both words in that phrase are wrong, because there's no experience and there's no yourself, but nevertheless, let's stick with this as if we're just having a casual conversation. As many of you may have experienced yourself. There's just this. There's just whatever is happening. In what? In the timeless presence. In timeless presence. That's not a good phrase, but it's no worse than any of the others. That's all there is. That's all there is. There's no past, no future, no person experiencing this. If there seems to be a person experiencing this, then there's the seeming of that. But there's no person experiencing it, no past, no future. So what the hell is there? What is left? This, whatever's arising in this. And at this point, when I sit down in this chair and start speaking, I never know which direction, this voice is going to take. I never know what's going to kind of come out. But at this point, when we're going in this direction, I usually say, I want to say two things about that. That there is just this. One is that that's a kind of astonishingly ludicrous thing to say to the mind, because the mind, which doesn't actually exist, but we can come back to that later as well, that the mind, which doesn't exist, lives in time, so it seems a ludicrous thing to say to the mind. Of course there's time, I have memory, I have expectation, that's past and future, I'm sitting here, that's the present. So it's a kind of mad thing to say, but equally, or also I would say, in a different way, it's in the realm of the bleeding obvious. That's another technical phrase which I sometimes use if you haven't come across it before. It's in the realm of the bleeding obvious, in a way. I mean, it's a dangerous thing for me now to ask the question and go, isn't it? Isn't it? I mean, maybe someone in here is going to say, well, no, it's not. Well, it may not be to each apparent person in this room, but I'm sure to others it is kind of obvious that it is only this that exists. The past might, you say, oh, the past exists as a memory. Yeah, well, where's memory? Only in this. The future might exist as an expectation. Okay. Where's that expectation? Only in this. So in a sense, what we're talking about, I would say, although it sounds very challenging, is absolutely and obviously the case. It cannot, in a way, it cannot be denied that it's the case. Of course, in other ways, the mind will come in and deny it frantically, but in a very fundamental way, it is just this. And when I mean just this, I mean it's timeless. You can't put a time on it. A second? Well, a second has a beginning, a middle and an end. It's just this. I sometimes go into this kind of fanciful little thing here. I'm one of those people, like most of us in fact, who understand nothing whatsoever about quantum mechanics. Of course I understand nothing about quantum mechanics, nobody does, but nevertheless I like to read books about it and occasionally kid myself that, well, maybe I did just understand a little tiny bit. You know, there's a sort of little fancy, you know, they have something in quantum mechanics, don't they, called Planck time, which is supposed to be the kind of briefest possible unit of time. Don't ask me what the hell that means. I like to think that that's what we're talking about here. Maybe, you know, maybe this is Planck time. Who knows? I don't know. We can ignore that. But it's kind of obvious. It's totally challenging in a way, and it's totally obvious in a different way. That's the suggestion from here. So what have we got? We've just got this. We've just got whatever is happening. And the simple suggestion in here is it may be possible for that to be seen, no matter how much this may think it's a person with a past and a future living in time, and a history, and all the other things that go with that. It's possible for that sense to collapse. And if it does collapse, oh, this is a really tricky bit, because we're talking about non-duality here. What does non-duality mean? It means not to. And what's the next paragraph going to say? Oh, God, I hate this bit. There's kind of two aspects to this. Oh no, it's just mad. There's kind of two aspects to this. But in terms of how this is often apprehended, and I say often apprehended because it doesn't have to be like this, what can happen is there can be a seeing of the complete emptiness of this. Empty of time, empty of space, empty of person, empty of substance. If I wanted to use an image, I might say like, you know, a shimmering haze or something like that. There can be a seeing of the complete emptiness of this, and this is sometimes described by speakers and in the literature as the seeing of nothing. This is no thing. This is nothing. It is completely empty. But then there can also be the seeing that at the same time it is its apparent opposite. In other words, it is also completely full. And these things it's also completely full. And these things may be seen separately or they may be seen together. But this is completely empty, it is devoid of substance, but it's also completely full. And what it's completely full of is unconditional love. I tend to throw that phrase in, well, if I'm going to throw it in at all, I tend to throw it in and perhaps leave it lying there quivering on the hearthrug or the floor and wait. If you want to come back to that, we can talk about that more, because it's a very challenging phrase for many apparent people. But that's a suggestion from here. That's kind of basically it. That's the pitch, if you like. That's what you've been invited here to buy. That's a terrible way of putting it, although I know many of you sitting in this room, some of you certainly sitting in this room, are as familiar with this as I am. So there's nothing and there's everything, and the everything is unconditional love.
And in a less cosmic way, is there a feeling of contentment?
Why should a feeling of contentment be any less cosmic? But I take the point. Yes and we start to tread on dangerous ground here, because as soon as we then start to ascribe any necessary characteristics to the seeing of this, such as contentment,
Or just being of content, yeah.
we're going in a tricky direction, because then we're setting up an expectation that this is about something. It's about something that I, as an individual, I, as an apparently separate person, can distinguish as particular characteristics, and can then sort of see as a desirable hook that I can chase. Now, if I can, this is a very misleading sentence, quite self-evidently, so if I can somehow bring about this state, then there may be more contentment. So almost every word in that sentence is wrong. There's no I, this is not a state, and there may or may not be more or less contentment. So in other words, this doesn't have to do with anything that the apparent person thinks that they feel, actually does feel. Nevertheless, as I've said many times before, there do seem to be commonalities in what can happen when this is seen. There do seem to be commonalities, yeah. But this isn't about, this is a route to more contentment, or this is a route to more satisfaction, or this is a route to less despair, or whatever. It may not be. Well, it's not a route to anywhere, this. The term non-duality, it's a very, very, very broad church, as I'm sure you're aware now. And there are many, many different speakers and writers with many, many different angles. And I think probably one of the most, if not the most misleading, is that this is a route to a happier person. It's not a route to a happier person. It's not a route to anywhere or anything. It can't possibly be. But if it was a route, it would be to a non-person. It would be to the disappearance of the person. This is not a route to a happier person. So it may or may not, there may or may not be more contentment.
A route would need space and time.
A route would need space and time. Yeah.
Start and a finish.
A start and a finish, and a guide known as a teacher, a spiritual teacher probably in this case. Yeah. And there are plenty out there who will offer you a program of what, let's call it, spiritual self-improvement. This has nothing to do with spiritual self-improvement. Again, all those words are wrong. There's nothing specifically spiritual or non-spiritual about this. It embraces everything, from the least to the most spiritual, whatever the hell that means. It's certainly not about improvement, and it's not about a person. Yeah.
But any formulation seems to me is going to be incorrect, simply because it's a formulation about something.
Yeah, yes, it's a bit harsh to say incorrect. I take the point.
I chose that. I was going to say wrong, but
yeah,
misleading. Whatever word, doesn't matter. It's not
absolutely
the same thing.
Absolutely, every word we say about this has to be misleading.
Yeah.
Or, if you want to be really cruel, wrong. Incorrect. Absolutely, totally. And yet, if there's going to be a communication, I was going to say if there's going to be a communication about this, it has to take place through words. That's actually not quite true, but let's just keep it simple. Usually it will be through words, and so always it will be, look at the hand desperately trying to pluck a word that doesn't exist out of the dictionary in the air.
Yeah.
The Zen that can be talked about is not the real Zen. It's that. So the non-duality that can be talked about is not the real non-duality, of course. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I think the introductory talk is finished now. So.
And yet, in this nothing, or whatever,
Presumably, there are images or things or apparently carry on. I mean, this is
mind blowing, really.
Yeah. Yes. Nothing is changed, yet everything is transformed. Have I quoted that already this afternoon? I have an appalling memory, by the way. I mean, one of the things with, a lot of people will say this, one of the things about, you know, whatever, seeing non-duality, whatever we call it, you know, is it really blows the memory apart. It really does. Yeah. There's an Australian writer about this who just said, memory gone, fucked beyond belief. But now we add to that for the character who does apparently live in time, although there's no time at all for it to live in, then we add to that the fact that the character gets older, and so the character, I'm talking about this character's memory gets worse and worse anyway.
Well, does that indicate nothing's held on to?
It might. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I think if we ignore the apparent aging, you know, what's often reported is that there's, you know, if there's awakening, there's a radical reorientation to time and particularly the past. And that may well be because the past is then seen as a story rather than something which belongs intimately to me. And so the emotional energy that's bound up in the past for, well, I'm going to say for a person, for many people, not for everybody, but for many people, the emotional energy which is bound up in the past tends to dissipate. So the past is still there as information, but the emotional entanglement with it tends to die. Yeah. And as I've said many times before, although there are no rules about this, there are commonalities. One of those commonalities that is reported is that the entanglement with the past dies, or certainly lessens to a great degree, the emotional entanglement with the past. Other commonalities, boredom tends to collapse or end. Depression tends to collapse or end. These are only tendencies, but they're quite strong tendencies. Yeah. Boredom, it seems to me, that's just occurred to me, seems to be intimately connected with time, doesn't it? Oh, I'm bored, I've got too much time on my hands. Oh, I'm bored, what should we do? What should we do now? What should we do tomorrow? If, you know, time collapses, maybe, I don't know, I'm just sitting here kind of idly, doodallying around. Maybe that's why boredom collapses. But it does. Not a rule. Not a rule. Definitely not a rule, but time after time after time I've spoken to people who said that.
So boredom is lack of interest, seems to me. If you're interested,
Yeah,
if there's
maybe.
interest.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I suppose interest. Yeah, the way I put it maybe is that interest trumps boredom.
Okay.
But I'm not sure that boredom is simply a lack. You know, it can be a neutral state of, you know. Yeah.
It's because there's no one to be bored.
Yeah, in a way. There's no one to be loving, and yet being loving still can continue.
Yeah. Just as boredom can. Yeah.
I mean, if I go into this any further, my way of... So I like this model, it's just a model, you know, that it's kind of like the kind of therapeutic background in me that likes this model, that it's a model that talks about feelings in terms of natural feelings and pseudo feelings.
Yeah.
And natural feelings are very few and very simple, and in this model they are usually considered to be fear, anger, sorrow, joy. That's it.
Frustration.
No, then we come on, no, frustration would definitely not, it would belong to the next group. But basically, four basic You know, if any of you've done psychotherapeutic groups and encounters and things like that, and it's a bit stuck and so forth, the therapist might sort of go around the room and say, right, are you mad, bad, sad or glad? Which is it? So 4. Right? And then there are all these other feeling words, aren't there? Frustration, that's a good one. Boredom, we've had that already. Irritation, anxiety, embarrassment, blah, blah, blah. Endless, on it goes. I mean, I used to teach this stuff and I'd have a whiteboard here, and between us, you know, as a group, we'd come up with about 30 or 40 of these words for what are sometimes called pseudo-feelings. In other words, they're not real feelings in the sense that we're not allowing ourselves to feel them in their fullness. What we're doing is neurotically damping down our feelings so that we only feel them partially. And there's a problem with that. In fact, well, there's 2 problems with that, which I'll come on to if I remember to in a minute. But before that, you see, you've got frustration, boredom, irritation. What's irritation? Tell me, what's irritation? What's irritation as a real feeling? Oh, yes, you do. Irritation.
Distraction. I want to do one thing, I want to do something else.
That's not irritation.
Anger.
Anger.
Ah,
Irritation, anger.
yeah.
So irritation is a kind of, is the neurotic form of anger, so it's called a pseudo-feeling. Right? Anxiety. Anxiety, there's only 4 to choose from.
Yeah.
You know, it's either love, anger, fear, I can't even remember the 4th one. Joy. Interesting, I forgot that one. I think it's because we're talking about them as a problem.
What about love?
Come on to love in a minute, we'll come on to love. No, really, hold on, that's really important. Where were we? Irritation. Anger. Anxiety. Fear, obviously, you see. So what's the problem? And in a way there is no problem, there's just life happening, but for the person, for the individual, there it is a problem. The point being that with these pseudo feelings like irritation, well, there's 2 problems. One is they can go on for a very, very long time, whereas natural feelings don't tend to last very long. Anger, in its raw form, does not tend to last very long. Neither does fear. The threat is over, the fear is over. Right, but irritation, probably some of us know at least one person who's been irritated for years. You know, when they wake up and go into irritation, and then they're still in irritation by the time they go to sleep. You can't be angry like that, it's too exhausting. The same thing with anxiety. You see, fear tends to be a kind of natural response to threat, and when the threat's gone, the fear's gone, or when it's been dealt with. Anxiety can go on, as some of us know, for hours, days, weeks, months or years. So that's one of the problems with pseudo-feelings. So when this energy, which is contracted down into the person, explodes into a more natural form, that's one of the things that can often happen. That these pseudo-feelings are no longer experienced. So what's experienced instead is the much rawer, much stronger experience of the feeling. So we're not just talking about peace, love, joy and harmony, man, here. We're talking perhaps about a much more powerful experienced anger, it could be.
What is, sorry, I was going to ask, what is boredom hiding, do you think?
Can we come on to boredom in
Okay.
a second?
Sure.
It's an important one. We need to come on to it in a second while I try and work out and answer that question in the back of my brain. But first, the other, not the back of my brain, where did that phrase come from? You know, but there is there's another problem with these pseudo feelings which tends to keep them going neurotically for a very long time, and that is not just that they're a kind of dampened down form of the feeling that can't kind of work its way healthily through the system, but the other thing is they tend to go with the story in the head, and the story in the head sustains the neurotic feeling, and the neurotic feeling sustains the story in the head. So I'm irritated by something. All these bloody people who blah 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 blah. You know, I'm anxious because of endless blah 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 blah, probably mostly about my past and a bit about what that's going to do in the future. Da, 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 da. Guilt, similarly, story about the past, another pseudo feeling, guilt. Embarrassment, oh my God, what must people think of me? Another sort of long story. And so this is another problem, that the story in the head tends to sustain the neurotic feeling, and the neurotic feeling sustains the story in the head. So no wonder you end up with somebody who's been irritated for the last 25 years. You know. And that collapses, the story is seen through, the feeling is felt in its entirety. The full energy of the feeling is felt, and then it's gone. You know.
But it's
I mean, it's like, you know, dogs can certainly manifest. I wish I hadn't picked on dogs now because they're too bloody human-like. Let's say cats. Cats can undoubtedly experience fear, but when the threat's gone, the fear's gone.
That was just struck me. These what you call pseudo feelings, irritation, anxiety, are clung onto for dear life somehow.
Yeah, my whole personality
Yes.
and my sense of who I am as a person, which I believe to be real,
Yeah.
may very well be hung on this particular hook. Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
No apparent way out.
No apparent way out, which is a jolly good job for the psychotherapist.
Yeah.
I mean, there are kind of ways on which we can work on these things through but that's not what we're talking about here. Yeah. Here we're talking about the possibility of this energy just going bang.
Yes.
Yeah. What were you going to?
Oh no, that was before about boredom. I don't think there's any.
Boredom, yeah. Yeah.
What's boredom related to? That's a different.
So it's a pseudo feeling,
Mm.
you see? So it's a pseudo feeling, boredom, another pseudo feeling. All the natural feelings repressed.
But love,
Yes.
because you haven't mentioned love.
Yeah.
amongst these, yeah.
Yeah. So, are you mad, bad, sad, or glad? So, love. I mean, it's an impossibly clumsy way to put it. I mean, you know, let's be charitable here. It's just the way that some desperate group facilitator is trying to get the group to open up when they won't. You know, let's try and see what's happening on a basic feeling level. But basically, yes. So in this model, which you can accept, you can reject, you can throw in the bin, you can think, well, there's 10% sense in it, but or whatever, 90% sense in it, whatever. But in this model, so we have mad, bad, sad, and glad. Glad is joy, bliss, love. And when we talk about non-duality, when we talk about seeing this in its entirety, we tend to talk about seeing emptiness and fullness. And what's the fullness? The fullness is love. And this is an astonishingly challenging statement. I'll rephrase this. This may be an astonishingly challenging statement for the mind. If we say that what's seen in this is that, oh, it's a really dangerous way of putting it, everything is unconditional love. Everything is an outpouring of unconditional love. You could say that's why everything exists. But what a challenge to the mind that is. You know, how long are we going to be talking about that with some objections to it before somebody sort of decides to drop the Hitler bomb? Help, you know. I'm a reasonable person, I think, you know. I feel sometimes embarrassed sitting at the front of a room talking like this. You know, the kind of, you know, the Richard puppet in here You know, who's a bit of a kind of political, intellectual Richard Puppet. You can't say that. You can't say that. Well, yeah, from the level of the individual in separation, it just sounds absurd to say that this is an outpouring of unconditional love. But as I've often said before, the difficulty in that phrase, that phrase unconditional love, the difficulty in that phrase is the word unconditional. It's not the word love, it's the word unconditional. And the mind of a parent person can never get unconditionality. Well, they don't understand what it means. I'm not saying you can't understand it, you understand what it means intellectually, blah, 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 but can never get it. Why not? Because the small I, if you like, the individual, the apparent person, always lives in conditionality. It can't help but do so. So the person always lives in, like, dislike, love, hate, approve, disapprove, etc. And some apparent eyes, some apparent people who get onto a spiritual path and absorb a lot of spiritual ideas and absorb this idea that it's good to be unconditionally loving, think, I can become unconditionally loving now, and so I start working on becoming unconditionally loving, and probably in 3 years' time I'll either be fantastically depressed or enormously irritated, but hiding it. I, as a person, cannot be unconditionally loving. Unconditional love has nothing to do with me as a person. Yet, nevertheless, unconditional love is. That's the end of the sentence, not is something. Unconditional love is, full stop.
I suppose whatever this emanation is, if it's an emanation, it's got to be totally accepting and uncritical within itself, as it were. So it must be unconditional.
Yeah, or we could put that the other way around. That is the nature of unconditional love. To be totally accepting, if you like. Yeah. Yeah. Which, if you think about, it's probably best not to think about the implications of that, because they're so challenging for the person, because the person has beliefs and attitudes, and worst of all, morality, clash with that quite often. Yeah. But again, we're not talking about a philosophy here. We're talking about and I pause because it's so difficult to find a word. The word experience doesn't work. Felt sense doesn't work. A direct seeing, that's as close as we can get. The direct seeing that everything and nothing are the same thing. Silence and noise are the same thing. Stillness and movement are the same thing. The direct seeing of that. Not some belief, not some spiritual practice that might take us clearer to that point, which isn't a point, but just simply the direct seeing of that. The astonishing apprehension that Piccadilly Circus on a busy Saturday afternoon is as still and silent as the most pure Buddhist temple, whatever the hell that phrase means. So one of the things that tends to collapse with this quite often, not necessarily, but quite often, is the spiritual stories. The because my dedication to a path of virtue which leads me to go and meditate in this Buddhist temple halfway up a Himalaya or whatever is kind of rendered somewhat ridiculous if it's seen that there is just as much peace, quiet, love and silence in Piccadilly Circus on a Saturday afternoon as there is in the most sacred place that my mind could imagine. And that goes for all sacred places and all apparently noisy places and profane places, let's say. There's no difference. The profanest place and the most sacred place are the same. They're both emanations, if you like, of stillness, silence and love. Oh, that's very challenging for the mind.
A friend of mine
So we
said,
don't have to seek this because it's always there. We may seek it. As characters, we may be engaged in the hopeless task of seeking this. Because we don't have to seek it because it's already what we are.
said he found, a friend of mine said his grandfather in World War I, charging across the trenches with bullets flying all around, experienced that peace and that
Yeah.
love.
Yeah.
And that hellhole, yeah.
Yeah. And that's a not uncommon experience that's in the most extreme conditions. This kind of seeing can arise. Yeah, but that's not a method. You know, I'm not recommending we go and join the SAS for that reason. Yeah.
I heard a guy describe recently how he'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer and I had 6 months or something to live. And he said it was the most peaceful experience he'd ever had after that, because it was kind of so overwhelming for the mind that
Yeah.
it just stopped. And there was this kind of peace.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Mm. Too much for the mind to comprehend.
Yeah. So there are certainly quite a lot of stories, if you listen to people, you know, of this apprehension, whatever it is we're talking about here, arising in extreme circumstances. Like, you know, one of the best known, I've forgotten his name, there's a...
Your teacher?
You know, the power of
Eckhart Tolle.
Eckhart Tolle, Power of Now. You know, after a long period of really intense depression, for example. So there are, you know, lots of stories where this apprehension arises out of extreme circumstances. There are equally lots of stories where this apprehension arises out of nothing remotely like that at all. It's just a normal summer's day and there I am buying a kettle in John Lewis and suddenly there's no one buying a kettle in John Lewis. Yeah. So this goes beyond any rhyme, reason or rationality. Yeah. In other words, in a sense, it doesn't map onto anything which belongs to our beliefs or experiences. Yeah.
No, if there's no space, it can't be very far away.
Of course. I'm not the first person to use the phrase, it's closer than you are to yourself. It already is. It already is the case. What the hell are we doing here in this talk? It already is the case. What a frustrating thing to be told by the speaker who sits at the front. I can remember the frustration that I felt being told that by the speaker who sat at the front. This is already the case. Yeah, it may be already the case, but I can't see it. Well, you never will see it. Oh, it's so frustrating.
It could be Tony.
It could be Tony. And at some point I think I began to think this is probably some kind of Zen plot. You know, in Zen, I think I used to believe they just want to mess with your mind so much, just on the off chance it might make it collapse. This is a Zen plot. No, it's not a Zen plot, it's just describing things as they are. There's no plot to it. There's no Zen to it, it's just describing things as they are. Yeah.
Nuisance is that even though I realise this intellectually, and I still live my life as if, well, obviously, I'm very much in duality, you know. It does, you are caught just as much in it. So even though there's an intellectual acknowledgement of what you're saying, in real life, so to speak, it's not lived as such.
Yeah, well, there's no such thing as this being lived. I mean, other than, of course, it's everything is this being lived, but I feel like in the sense that you mean that, there's no such thing as this. You know, I mean, I guess I could live my devotion to, you know, the Abrahamic God, maybe. Or perhaps if I was a Buddhist, I could live by the precepts of the great Lord Buddha. But there's nothing about this that we can live by. Living by this is me. I mean, everything you do is living by this, if you like. So the phrase is rendered meaningless. Can't get away from this. Lacing up your shoes in the morning is, if you like, living by this, whatever the hell that means. You cannot get away from it. It is everything.
It's not really. It's everything, and yet there's tremendous, powerful urge to somehow find it.
Yeah.
To somehow what?
Powerful urge to find it everywhere. I mean, everyone,
Yeah.
presumably, one way or another.
Because somehow the part of the everything is the belief that this isn't everything.
Yeah.
And part of the everything is the belief that I have lost something, that I exist and I have lost something.
Yeah.
And I, through effort, maybe through effort, can find it. Yeah.
Because I suppose, for me is everything for me at the moment, you know.
Right.
It's not, I live a life where me is everything, yeah.
I sort of, I understand, so you say the intellectual, so all the issues with the unconditional love I have no problem with, but they still are concepts, and it still
Yes.
feels like me looking at it and conceptualising unconditional love, which I have no problem with, but it's still me,
Yeah.
like you say, the movie of me looking out at the world like I'm the centre character, which I know is fiction, but I intellectualise it's fiction, I'm not experiencing the
Yeah.
difference, and so that's my problem. There's no concept I have a problem with, it's just
Yeah.
that I know I still identify as a me.
Yeah. And that's the story of so many of us.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's kind of a bit of a mystery as to why, in that case, there should be a fascination with this, and yet for some of us there is. When, you know, while that's still the case, while there's still very much a person and that sense of separation and really why should there be a fascination with this? And yet it arises for some apparent people.
Because it's
So
not
it's a
happy.
mystery.
It's
What?
not, 'cause it's not nice being me.
Well, yeah, but there's so many other ways of either distracting ourselves from being me or searching for an end to being me, which in a way is simply another distraction. So in a sense, there isn't really a difference between, you know, going to the pub and playing darts, going to the horse racing track and going to the Zen monastery. In a sense, there isn't a difference.
But me is just an idea, just a concept,
Well,
just a notion, isn't it?
I would say that me is an energy, it's an energy of contraction. You see, if it's just a concept, if it's just an idea, it's relatively easy to change.
But that's, I mean, it helps for me anyway, from what I've read from other teachers, to practice self-inquiry and meditate on
Well, it may
kind of
do.
like a deconstruction of,
Try it.
yeah.
I mean, you're not going to get that from me. I mean, I'm aware, yeah, I mean, yeah, some teachers will say that, I think the word teacher is quite important there. You know, some teachers will say that, and they're teachers because they can teach you how to do that, and some speakers don't say that, right? Because they've got nothing to teach you. You know, where non-duality is concerned, I've got nothing to teach you. I've got lots of things to teach you. I mean, I was a lecturer, facilitator, teacher, blah 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 for all my professional life. Masses of things I could teach you, you know, but nothing about this. You know. I'm highly suspicious of teachings where this is concerned because there's nothing to teach. You know, there can be sharings, there can be attempts at explication, you know. Mostly there can be, you know, there can be attempts at communication, which, you know, which some of us enjoy. But I'm very suspicious of teachers where this is concerned. And I'm very well aware of the paths and practices that are on offer. And I just said, well, good luck with that, you know. But in a sense, it's irrelevant because although there may seem to be someone there and there and there and here or whatever who seems to have some kind of choice or decision to make about, well, shall I practice this or not? There isn't really. You know, that's just, again, part of the great game, part of the play, if you like. So in the story of Richard, here was a character who meditated passionately for, I can't remember how long. I mean, now this character still meditates a bit, but just not passionately anymore. But so what?
But in the, say, the illusion of whatever happened or didn't happen, like a thorn removing a thorn, like a thorn removing a thorn. So it's like a kind of paradox in a way. There's an illusion of somebody unpicking themselves and realising you're a divine puppet. So whatever you call them, the people who have this knowledge of non-duality.
It's not knowledge, but yeah.
Yeah, whatever it is, you have to use some kind of language.
Yeah, sure.
From what I've understood, self-inquiry and questioning who is having this experience and breaking down the concept of, I guess, the language, I and me, and that's been quite helpful to progress. I know there's no progression, but have some kind of understanding.
I think all sorts of things can obviously be helpful to the person as they navigate this thing which appears to be their life. When it comes to what we're talking about here, I mean, I'm going to sit here, you know, at the front of the room and assert, you know, that nothing that the I, the me, the person thinks that they are doing has any bearing on this. Then that's what's happening. There's a person at the front asserting that. You know, well, so what? But I'm aware that, you know, these teachings are popular. Of course they are. Yeah. I think there can be, one of the astonishing things about this, even just to sort of, I mean, the seeing, I can't remember if we were talking earlier about how awful my memory is. I can't remember if we already covered this ground this afternoon, you know, talking about, you know, that possibility of a split-second, instantaneous sort of flash of awakening in which just the emptiness of this is seen. Yes, we talked about that already.
You mentioned it.
For many years, actually. We talked about this for many years, never mind this afternoon. I think what can often be the case with that is just the staggering and astonishing realisation that nothing that this, whatever this thought it was, nothing that this has ever done could have possibly had any bearing, you know, on that seeing. Because the seeing is that this doesn't even exist. You know. And it's just mind-blowing. Like, what? Yeah. So whether, I mean, you know, I was an assiduous spiritual seeker for many years, and an assiduous meditator and follower of gurus and da-da-da-da-da. If it was an offer in the spiritual candy floss shop, I bought it and I did it. I've even written a very, very, very good book about it, if you'd like to buy it as well. Did the camera get that ad? I hope so. It's an astonishing shock to see that's irrelevant. It could never have any bearing. You know, what we're talking about is so far beyond what this, I want to go all melodramatic now at this point and say what this puny little human, you know, this person here, you know, thought it was doing. It's such a shock.
But that's what's, it's like a paradox, because in a way, you, the character, the divine puppet, does do something in a way, and we're all sitting here doing something.
Yeah.
But from the broadest perspective, nothing happens. Because if you just did nothing and sat on a bus, you wouldn't have an understanding of. The language doesn't really do it justice because it's kind of limited. But if you did nothing, then nothing would happen. So
You
it would
can't
still
do
be a
nothing.
belief in a person.
You can't do nothing. If you were, I think you were saying if you were sat on a bus doing nothing, I'm not sure how you were going to finish that sentence. I thought you were going to say, you know, if you're sitting on a bus doing nothing, then nothing will
happens.
happen.
Yeah.
But you can't sit on a bus and do nothing. You cannot sit on a bus and do nothing. Something will always happen.
Sitting on a bus is happening.
Sitting on a bus is happening, and within that, I guarantee that other things will be
But only
happening
to the
as well.
illusory. What I'm saying is to the illusory person. Then.
But it's the illusory person who is doing self-inquiry.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
That's why it's a paradox.
And what I'm asserting, which you certainly don't have to buy, and I get the impression you're not buying it, is that whatever the illusory person does, precisely because of that word illusory, you know, it can create, you know, the impression that I am somehow moving closer to something or whatever, but this isn't about me moving closer to something. I can't make myself disappear, or to put that a bit more exactly, you know, I've stopped because I'm resisting using the word that popped into my head, but I use it, the false self cannot make itself disappear, precisely because it's a false self.
Whenever I've had a glimpse, it's always been a surprise, because it's got nothing to do with me.
Yes.
It's just a surprise.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's got
Yeah.
nothing to do with me at all. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because when there's a glimpse, I'm not there. It can't have anything to do with me. Yeah. There's a book called A Glimpse of Nothingness, which is, it's not really exactly about this, it's more Zen orientated. It's a lovely book, written by a Dutch guy, I can't remember his name, but you know, if there's a wet Sunday afternoon you want to pass, it's I think it's quite a sweet book. A Glimpse of Nothingness. When there's a glimpse, it's of nothingness, so I'm not there. It can't be anything to do with me, because I'm not there. You see, we're not talking about the transpersonal here. The transpersonal, I mean, the word kind of, you know, the transpersonal, it's not the personal, but it's got personal in the word. It's a bit of a giveaway. The transpersonal is, in a way, still to do with me. You know, I've gone beyond me, so there's still me, and now I've gone beyond it. What we're talking about here, there's nothing transpersonal about this. If you were a devoted spiritual, I was a devoted spiritual seeker for about 30 years. I mean, it's a hell of a shock. 30 years, and then, okay, there was never anybody who was a spiritual seeker. Transpersonal goes beyond the person, so the person is a given in the transpersonal. And the shock of this is seeing that the person never existed.
How does it help then that myself, the person sitting here listening to you, because I'm the person absorbing the information, and so myself, the person, wants to understand and then realise that this is not going to happen. So, or even the concept, like getting on board with it, like there's no point because I'm a person. So how does this help?
Doesn't help. I would take issue with the one thing I think you said there. This isn't going to happen.
Yeah. So it's
well,
because you know you think you sort of absorb and you get on board, and then you relinquish or something,
yeah.
and then eventually and you said before disappears, then it disappear. I disappear or something. But this can happen because it's me wanting this thing to disappear.
Yeah, it's
So-
you wanting it's you wanting you to disappear,
Yeah.
but when you disappear, that'll all be irrelevant. That's irrelevant.
But I'm wishing, grasping to disappear.
You
the
can't
act
help
is,
that.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it seems like an oxymoron. Like, what am I doing? I should have just never started.
You should have.
Never started.
Yeah, but there's.
Because then it's this grasping at something that's just,
Yeah, well, I want to say something. I'm going to immediately contradict it and say
Mm.
something hopefully a little bit more dramatic, But you had no choice about starting it. You had no choice about starting it because you started it. Now I'm going to count that out and say, of course, it's far worse than that in actuality. There isn't a you that that did or didn't have a choice about starting it. What's sitting there is simply an awareness, an experience. Some of that experience is of an apparent past, and in that apparent past, this apparent you apparently started something that led here. I don't know what that was, but it doesn't matter. That's how it seems. That's how it seems.
It has led to more glad and
To
sad.
more glad
and sad.
Well, there you go, that's a result. But this isn't about results. Yeah.
It's not even about happiness.
It's not about happiness, it's not, no. It's
Well,
not.
peace is something that, is nice to experience than
Yeah.
turmoil.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm happy to sit on this chair and assert that, I've talked to an awful lot of apparent people, talked to and had, correspondence from them. So an awful lot of apparent people who are no longer people. And there does certainly seem to be some commonalities, and now we're kind of, dangling goodie bags again. But there are, it's just a matter of fact, there are commonalities, and that's one of them, more peace. Yeah, another is disappearance of boredom, as I was saying before. There may be other things that the mind considers more central and more important, which would bring in the word life, for example. Yeah, but actually you're not sitting here. Whatever personal motivation there might be going on, some from the past, which has sort of put you in this room today, is a story. Just like everything else the mind thinks. Story. Yeah. And what the mind wants most is, to rationalise. Well, what the mind wants most is to continue running its tape, its primary tape. The mind really has only one primary tape that it runs sort of pretty much all day long, which is see I'm right, see I'm right, see I'm right. But in a sense, it's also all irrelevant, because the fact is you are sitting here and nothing could be any different. I think I've already said that at starting already. It's the most stunningly obvious. It's so stunningly obvious. Why is he bothering to say that? Nothing could ever be any different to what it is. I mean, that is utterly banal and also extremely profound, I'm going to claim. And if we get that even just on a mind level, it might produce some relaxation. And whereas, relaxation, in a sense, is just relaxation, so what? I'm very taken, I use this quotation quite often. I don't quote that much from the Buddhists, but nevertheless I love this one. It's from an English Buddhist. Relaxation is the key to Buddhahood, right here and there. So there's nothing we could do, but if there were anything we could do, it would relax. Am I quoting or misquoting William Blake? Damn braces, bless relaxes. I think I'm quoting him. William Blake, less relaxes. Anything that relaxes you. By braces, he didn't mean things that hold your trousers up. He meant anything that constricts you.
The thing that's running to my head at the moment is if wherever there's a sense maybe that things are wrong or not as they should be, this is completely denying what is really. Can you
Spell that out a bit more?
try? Well, you know, you get the sense or feeling that, you know, it could be better, or it's not quite right, or I'm uncomfortable, or I'm not there, or whatever it is. But that sense, that all of that is just a denial of what is.
Yeah, in a way, it is. It's all mind
That's what I'm
stuff.
saying.
Yeah. I mean, it is also, I mean, I get what you're saying. It is also what is,
Yeah,
of course.
That's right, but within
the mind
the
stuff
framework
of what
that
is.
you said, yes, but that's the end of
Yeah.
it, but it isn't just. Yes. That's,
Yeah. Yeah.
yes.
Mind stuff is also what is. It's just it can be a particularly annoying aspect of what is
Yeah.
sometimes. Yeah.
Right.
The same group I go to tell you to be more and live more in the body. And I was just thinking of the scenario where you're walking along, perhaps, you know, thinking of all sorts of things, and all of a sudden something comes towards you, and you immediately go push it away, and you, for those few seconds you're not there, just the body's sort of instinct comes in, and then just straight after you, for goodness sake, you know, the thoughts come back in, but just those few seconds, minute seconds that there's no you know.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Did you say that the practice is to sort of encourage you to be more in the body?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's therapeutically great anyway, isn't it? I mean, that's what a lot of therapists will do.
They said you put yourself into the body, but you're washing up or anything.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Why is that? Why is that?
Well, why is it therapeutically?
Yeah, is that to do with self-awareness?
It seems to be, I mean, it's got a lot in common with a lot of kind of more body-orientated approaches to therapy. There just seems to be something about, it's a bit like what I was saying about, you know, pseudo-feelings that go with the story in the mind. There's just something about getting caught up in the story in the mind where it can just replicate itself forever, and somehow everything in the body just gets stuck. And there's something about, you know, this is therapy speak here. You know, it really is, right? But you know, there seems to be something about. I'm hesitating about words I use, but never mind. It doesn't matter. You know, the reason I'm hesitating is it sounds very purposive, which doesn't quite fit with what we're saying, but it doesn't matter. This is what, you know, a therapist might say, but that transferring the attention from the story in the head to the feeling in the body is what often allows the psychophysical system to free itself up of whatever stuck energy in there is producing, for example, irritation. You know, I mean, anger is a natural response to various things, including certain threats, and, you know, it's protective, it's a good thing, it's protective, it can be protective, and it tends not to be problematic in itself, it just goes through the body until whatever's dealt with is dealt with. But if it turns into, you know, this stuck energy, it becomes irritation, continual annoyance, whatever, story in the head or whatever, you know, it's pretty destructive. So it's just noticed, it's been noticed by a lot of apparent people, whether they're Zen teachers or psychotherapists or whoever, whatever, but, you know, if the attention goes from the story in the head, which endlessly repeats, to the feeling in the body, If that happens, then the feeling in the body doesn't endlessly repeat, it tends to process itself and free itself. That's all. So there's a lot of crossover between particularly kind of the more body-orientated psychotherapists and some of these, I'm going to call them very loosely, spiritual paths. So that kind of very famous phrase, you know, made famous by Eckhart Tolle, of being in the now, in a sense it's the same thing, it's pay attention to what's actually happened. Just pay attention. It's not going to get us anywhere with what we are here to look at today, because we can't get anywhere with that, but therapeutically, you know, it can be very effective. And it's tea time.